Welcome back to 101 East. Now, Asia's military powers insist that an arms race is not underway and that military spending is simply in line with defence needs and global norms. Part of the attempts to soften the image of the military is to use their forces for civilian benefits in the event of natural disasters, say, or emergencies. Tony Cheng reports on the deployment of soft power.
In central Thailand, a mock field hospital has been set up, part of the Cobra Gold military exercises involving 4 Asian nations and the United States. As part of this exercise, the combined forces have set up a field hospital in a local school. They're offering things like dentistry, pediatrics and ophthalmology. And while this is just an exercise, it serves a very real purpose, and that is to win over the hearts and minds of the local people. The application of soft power seems to be as important to a modern army as guns and tanks. Humanitarian operations and disaster relief are a major part of these rehearsals and the closest these nations have ever come to working together. Last year, the US military flew emergency relief into China following the Sichuan earthquake, something that might have been unthinkable 5 years ago. But when Myanmar was hit by Cyclone Nargis, leaving tens of thousands dead and many more without food and water, attempts to bring in supplies were thwarted. Myanmar's ruling generals have bitterly held on to power for nearly half a century, keeping the country hostile and isolated. Their main opponent, however, seems to be their own people, and despite bans in most parts of the world, the army is still supplied with munition sales from China. Across the border in Thailand, the veneer of democracy appears very thin. The country has endured more than a dozen coups since 1945, the latest in 2006. The current Democrat government holds a tenuous grip on power with a mandate from the military, not the public. The same military who stood by last year as opponents of the last elected government brought the country to a standstill, showing they can wield their power passively or actively. Observers now see the Thai military reaping the rewards for their intervention.
The military, since they've been back, since the coup in September 2006, you can look at the numbers. The military budgets have increased alarmingly, substantially over the past 3 years, and they're requesting more high technology weapons and all kinds of programs and so on. So even on the budgets, very clearly that they are back in business.
Still, critics claim the Thai military remains a relatively ineffective force. It's one of the hazards of having a military more concerned with its own economic and political influence than the day-to-day business of being a professional army.
When you look at these countries that have that example of strong involvement in politics and in business, and I think most notably of Indonesia and Thailand, you also look at military forces that are close to incompetent.
It's those levels of professionalism that the US is trying to raise. Here, Thai and Indonesian soldiers are shown how to create a UN safe haven. Already overextended in the Middle East, the US is keen to share the burden of its duties as the world's policeman amongst its allies.
I think in this century, in this next decade, it's going to be very dramatically focused in. The military, no matter what country, is now coming together and getting more involved in UN peacekeeping operations to show a global face.
Perhaps it's on the high seas that the changing shape of Asia's military will be most obvious. The US is currently building a new port in Guam to house forces no longer welcome in the Philippines and Japan. And several nations have sent naval vessels to join international forces combating piracy off the coast of Somalia. In today's troubled economic waters, the priority for most of these countries is to keep Asia's vital trade routes open.
Well, still with me are in Washington, John FEFFER, a think tank director with the Institute of Policy Studies in the US. Here in Kuala Lumpur, Dr. Tim HUXLEY, Executive Director of Singapore's International Institute of Strategic Studies, and MOHAMED JAWHAR HASSAN, Co-Chair of the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific. Thank you for staying with us. John, let me come to you first. The soft power issue is obviously one way of mitigating concern about these things, but let's talk a little bit about the leakage of arms into the mainstream population, into the hands of people that are non-government issues. After 9/11, the US was making pacts with everybody, giving them arms simply for their cooperation in the war on terror. We've got arms proliferation everywhere. How concerned should we be about that in this part of the world?
Well, I think you should be very concerned. I mean, for the most part, the United States has been focusing in Asia on the nuclear question, nuclear non-proliferation, particularly North Korea, the connection between Pakistan and North Korea and Syria. But I think we should pay attention as well to conventional arms proliferation. Many conventional arms can end up in the hands of people that you end up fighting against. And this should be a concern for many of the countries in Asia, particularly because arms exports become a major argument for how to justify arms spending increases. In other words, how can you make that argument domestically, especially with a global recession, that you should continue to spend money on arms? Well, the answer is, well, just sell those arms. South Korea, for instance, increased its arms exports from about $250 million to $1 billion this last year, and it plans to go up to $3 billion. Where is that? Where are those weapons going to, and will they go into the hands of countries that ultimately South Korea may have to worry about in the future?
Let's talk a bit more about some of the hotspots then. Is a concern on the India-China border. There's China ally with Pakistan, that whole configuration there. How do you see those strategic alliances playing out, and are they a concern?
I think both China and India are both working on balancing each other as well as cooperating with one another. So you'll find moves in both directions. There was, for instance, a year, 2 years ago, a friendship treaty between China and India. They are working towards managing their border dispute better, and the trade is growing increasingly. I think China is going to be India's largest trading partner soon, if it is not already so.
So let me stop you there for just a second. I mean, the trading situation is an interesting one, and these treaties that you speak of are designed to maintain the status quo. But the trade issue brings into question the future resources question, and the competition between China and India for resources is one thing that many people seem to be worried about.
I think competition for resources is not just China, India. All major economies and smaller ones are competing for scarcer resources. And most of this competition will be done legally, benignly, through trade, not through military means. I think we sometimes play up this military thing, but of course, we should not completely discount these things. For instance, Gwadar base, which is jointly, Pakistan, China, China wants an outlet there, and then in Myanmar, etc. But these are things which countries normally do. China, for instance, 80% of its oil comes through the Malacca Straits. It's worried in case, just like Japan, something. So these are things nations normally do, which has risk factor there. We should place that risk in context.
Let me be the devil's advocate, though, on this, because, that all sounds good sitting in a studio in comfortable armchairs, but the reality is that the oil situation, the competition for power and resources with the growth of China and India is becoming fierce, and we know it's becoming fierce. Many people still argue that the entire adventure in Iraq was essentially rooted in that idea. To suggest that this is not going to become worse in the future is naive, isn't it?
The key point is that this would only arise acutely in the event of a major conflict. For example, China would only really have to worry about its energy supplies being interrupted in the event of a major conflict, for example, with the United States over Taiwan. Then perhaps a threat somewhere in the Pacific or the Indian Ocean to China's maritime energy supplies in oil tankers could arise. But in normal circumstances, this is not something which major powers would have to worry about.
One final quick question to you, Mohammed. In this part of the world, what would you pinpoint as perhaps being the condition, the situation, the country to watch that perhaps causes you most concern?
Well, I think the thing that can become a problem is when one side overreacts. What I mean by that is, I think the push for destabilization to some extent comes actually from the US and its allies, if I may say so, because of this tendency to push and push and push and to contain and constrain what is seen as a very emerging, power, China, which actually is generations behind the United States. And the United States actually has its network of alliances in the region with Japan, with Australia, etc., and all of them are upgrading their capabilities. So there is less to worry about than the way it's made to be, to seem. So this is what, can cause counter, actions by the other party, which, you end up this so-called security dilemma. What you do, which you think is legitimate and for your defense, is seen as provocative and, aggressive on the other side. So there is no real control, and you go out of, you go into a tailspin.
There we will have to leave it. Gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed for talking to us today. And that's all from us on this show. Until next time, it's goodbye.